Okay. So this program will be recorded and we'll post it in a week or so to we have a YouTube a channel, and we'll post it for people who want to review it, or who, not everybody can meet Tuesday evening at 7 o'clock. So that's how we operate, and it's up to the speaker. The speaker decides whether to record the program or not. That's the speaker's intellectual property, actually. So before I begin, I like to make sure we have a land acknowledgement. And I'm going to read this because it's a complicated issue, and I want to make sure that the words are proper. And sometimes people send me corrections, and that's really good. But I'd like to acknowledge that our Los Angeles Santa Monica Mountains CNPS chapter recognizes that we occupy land originally and still inhabited and cared for by the Tongva, Tataviam, Serrano, Chumash, and Quiche Nation peoples. Now that's a small number of the many tribes that are also in the state of California. We're very diverse. We honor and pay respect to them, past, present, and emerging, as they continue their stewardship of California's lands and their native flora. So I'd like to introduce this evening Travis Longcore, who is an adjunct professor at the UCLA Institute for the Environment and Sustainability. I think many of you know he is well known for his advocacy, scholarship, and research in the Southern California area, especially regarding environmental matters and ecological matters. Tonight, he will introduce us to the Los Angeles Landscape History Project that has explored and mapped the local landscape, providing insight into the pre-modern functioning of the landscape and the historical distribution of plants and vegetation types. So Travis, unmute yourself and.
All right. Hello, everyone. Yeah, let's see if I can find a button to push here.
Great.
There we go.
Continue.
Slides coming through?
Yeah.
All right. So nice to see so many people here. Any number of familiar names. I won't call you out individually, but it's nice to see everyone. So I'm going to talk tonight about a project that we wrapped up the most recent version of this bigger project about the landscape history of California and of Southern California last Indigenous Peoples Day. And it was because that this particular iteration of the project was funded by the Haynes Foundation and had as our co-PIs representatives of three of the tribes in the region to co-create a history of the landscape and better understand it from the perspective not just of the quote unquote natural landscape, but the indigenous landscape, the landscape as it was lived in and as it is still finds value for and is used by native peoples in our region. And so just to start as an acknowledgement, the PI on that was Phil Ethington from USC, a historian who I did the previous chapter in this project with as well. And through that previous project that wrapped up in 2020 and involving with Phil as a historian, it really brought home to me, even though I had been working on historical ecology since grad school in the 90s, that I had just completely missed the boat in terms of fully understanding and integrating the indigenous peoples who were managing that land into the work that I was doing. And so it became very clear as we continued on that we had to put together an interdisciplinary team, which is what you see there. with the co-PIs, and then all the contributors, those who have tribal affiliations are listed there. And I'll just mention this was a collaboration between 3 tribes, USC, UCLA, Cal State LA, Cal State Long Beach, Cal State Northridge. Um, and and was a lot of heavy lifting. So as I report on all of this, it's both this project and these people, plus I think I added them up for my students today, something on the order of 10 to 15 previous projects in Southern California on various locations that we can talk about as we go on with the number of other collaborators over the years since about 1995 when I started. And the reason to look at historical ecology is so much of our landscape looks like the upper right, and it makes it almost impossible to remember or imagine that there were places that looked like the left and the bottom. And so I think that because we have so transformed this landscape, it makes it hard to be creative and inspired and respectful of it as a natural landscape. You kind of need to go back into history in order to get a better grasp at how it worked, and also the meaning that it has and had for people historically and continuing today. And this map here, this map, let's see if that'll go back, maybe eventually. Come on, there we go. Is from, some of you might recognize it, from Terrestrial Vegetation of California. It's the Kukler Potential Natural Vegetation Map from the 70s of California. And I actually had this on the wall next to my desk in grad school. And I was very interested in kind of making it better, to be quite honest, because I knew even as a transplant here from back east, what I was learning and working on some endangered butterflies, that some of these things weren't entirely correct, that southern seashore communities piece was really only on the beach, and then inland it was something different. And it still had the marina in there instead of the Ballona wetlands. And so and no, salt marsh indicated there. And so I thought that this could be made better, and got handed a file folder of about 6 typewritten pages, some historical photographs, a couple of tables from Rudy Mattoni, who is my sort of field advisor. And it was to describe the LA coastal prairie and its vernal pools. No one had described vernal pools from LA County at the time. And it was this area here. And he's like, I think there's a paper in here, go ahead and work on it. And that's what I did as my, what we refer to as a pot boiler paper, the one you kind of put in the back and simmer along and work on when you don't have anything else to do on your other projects, or you want to procrastinate your main project and you go work on your pot boiler. And so I'll show you some results from that, but that started in the mid 90s and moved on, but inspired by this map of the idea of a landscape that was more in equilibrium with its climate and disturbance regime than what we looked out the window and saw. And so it brought in all the tools of historical ecology, which are aerial photographs going back to the 20s, both orthogonal and oblique, all sorts of maps, coast surveys, soils maps, survey information, written texts, newspapers, and then in this most recent project, Indigenous knowledge as well, in terms of their understanding of the landscape. And really, as we came to understand it, we weren't telling them anything that they didn't know. They were happy to see the parallel ways that the landscape could be understood and known. And so we're using the past here to understand the present, and to envision its future potential. And I always have to put this at the beginning of any historical ecology talk. This is not about recreating the past and saying it has to be this. It's about understanding the ecological, cultural, and physical patterns and process that shape the landscape. And cultural is so important because Los Angeles, this area, Southern California, has been managed by people for 10,000 years, give or take. And so it's not just the way things were, but the way they worked, how they were managed, how the landscape functioned, why certain things were where they were, and what the diversity of those things were, even though they're missing today. And so it's about layering together information from many different sources to get this picture of the landscape. And for us who are interested in vegetation, and perhaps those of you who are interested in restoration, gives you some inspiration to understand where things were and what could be somewhere, but also to identify what were the processes that led them to be there in the first place. If those processes aren't there today, maybe we don't put the vegetation back where it was if the process to support it is no longer present. So all these things are just about contextualizing this landscape that we're in now, and I hope can be used to inspire and inform the way that we manage it. Through this project and with our 3 tribal partner groups in the Indigenous Knowledge Group, we had 6 or 7 focal village sites, 2 in the San Fernando Valley that were associated mostly with the Tataviam, 2 out in the Santa Monica Mountains associated with the Chumash, and then 3 downtown Whittier Narrows and Long Beach, Yangna, Shivanga, and Paravunga, that are associated with the Keech, Gabriel Band of Mission Indians. And the choices here, after we got the group started and together, were made by the Indigenous Knowledge Group themselves. They were self-operating within as co-PIs on the project, and decided who to involve, what places to investigate further, and to tell their stories. And I just want to say right now that I'm not going to sit here and tell you a bunch of Indigenous knowledge, because it's not my place to do that. But we do have a product, a website where there are a lot of things that the group and the tribes for themselves put out in their own words, and video and text and maps, etc., supported by other portions of the project that you can consult. But it became very clear to me in the project that it wasn't my role to tell these stories. This was my role to support and allow them to control and tell what they wanted to tell about these places and how they, their importance to them and their history and place. So for example, Yangna's downtown Los Angeles. This is some product from the group. It's the historic topography, historic vegetation types, an old channel, the LA River. But there is a whole description of this on the website if you go to it, where Andy Salas from the Keech Nation talks about Yangna and Mwanga, which is the lookout area up here in what became Elysian Park and Griffith Park. And so there's a 2-minute video where he describes it and goes through, and we have done our best to illustrate that, so that the stories from the people who are the lineal descendants of the people who lived on this land for 10,000 years, so that they are the ones in whose voice this comes, and it's their story to tell. So that's, I'll give you the link to this at the end, but you can, if you're eager, you can go Google mapping Los Angeles landscape history, and you'll probably find this right away. But what I do want to go through here is the series of methods that we used to put things on the map, basically, and then go through what all of the different vegetation types of this indigenous landscape were that we believe were present in the LA Basin watershed area, and actually beyond. And so there'll be a series of these sort of methods pieces, and then I'll go through the map and walk through each of these different types. So that's sort of the outline of the rest of the talk. So indigenous trade routes are built, okay, it's thinking, from a series of old maps. There is this map from the 1930s with the number of frankly racist symbols on them, using a teepee for indigenous sites when they weren't using teepees. But this was a starting point. Phil Ethington, my colleague at USC, and the Indigenous Knowledge Group worked on this quite a bit. And it has all these old pathways on it that then were confirmed through multiple sources. So the old salt road going down to Redondo Beach where they had salt ponds, that old road goes all the way out to the Mojave. This is the other end of the old salt road. And we have confirmation through a number of sources that these predated the Spanish routes. So the Mission Road, the Spanish then used that, but the old salt road was one that was used by indigenous people long before and as a trade route. And so I won't go into the many, many maps and resources that went into it, but go right to the final project. Every one of the dots on here is a known or a named indigenous site in the LA region. And every one of these roads was confirmed through the research to be a pre-Spanish, pre-European contact route that was used. And then often it turned into a Spanish route because these were the logical places to go. But it sort of indicates the extensive trade network that there was. And it doesn't just stop here. It goes all the way into the southwest, down into Mexico, over into New Mexico. And there are, in fact, indigenous tribes in New Mexico, Arizona area that are named for things that they traded with the coastal Los Angeles tribes for. So things from our coast, our products, I mean the early Angelinos before the Europeans were here, the indigenous Angelinos, that they were trading items that ended up so important to the inland portion that they were completely named after them in subsequent archaeological investigations. So this is just a little reminder that this was a very well developed, very highly connected, even though it wasn't as fast as the freeways, it was an incredible trade network that led goods and traded items all across the regions and had cultural interchanges going about them, which is a nice way as we go through to remember that this landscape was not just a static, quote unquote, natural landscape. It was one that was being used and managed by the people who were living there on it. And once you get before people, on this landscape, you're into another climate. So you kind of can't think about the whole thing without it being one unified whole. So that was one piece, was the trade routes. The second piece was topographic reconstruction, because as we look at the landscape today and try to do things like model it to figure out where the water flows, we have a very modified topography. And so in order to get something closer to the natural topography, we looked at the earliest topographic maps, and this is a bit pixelated because we've zoomed out, but this is a number of USGS topographic quads that you can see there's some lines where the colors change a little bit. That's a line between two different quadrangles. These are the ones that we get, and this is the Elysian Valley going through here. If you don't recognize it, Griffith Park is up there. And so we stitched all these together from this and then extracted, and this was led by the group at Cal State Long Beach, Suzanne Perlich and her crew, extracted all the topographic lines and assigned elevations to them. And when you do that, you can then create a three-dimensional rendering of the landscape as it was in that historic map. So this is just one of those quads down at Long Beach. And if I click on this, we should get a video. We'll see if that moves. And what you're seeing now is the quad that's now been draped over the topography that's been extracted from the information that's in those lines. And then you can kind of get a better sense of what the landscape was like. And if you compare that to current day topography, you can also understand change quite a bit more. It helps you just to visualize. And once you take that, all the map off it, you're left with sort of a 1920s topography, which is 20s to the 30s is when these maps were done at this scale. It was an enormous amount of work. It was a number of the students at Cal State Long Beach had come from India, and they invited their classmates back in India to participate as well. And it was something like 3,000 hours of work to extract all the points from these lines and create a topography that doesn't have the hills chopped off for our developments and doesn't have the freeways and doesn't have the rivers that are encased in concrete, because most of that post dates when these first topos were done. We still have work to do on it. This just got done. It was more than we ever imagined we'd get done on the time period we had and the funding that we had. But the students sort of they Tom Sawyered it. And there was a lot of volunteer hours that went in. And we ended up with this at the end of the project, and we need to do some more work to clean it up and fill in some of the extra pieces. But this is a pre-freeway, pre-channelization topographic map at high detail of the LA region. Then the next thing we did, and this was led by the crew at Cal State Northridge, was to create a seamless historical aerial photo mosaic, which I affectionately refer to as the Google Earth time machine. So you're used to being able to do something like this on Google Earth, where you've got a photograph that's draped over the topography, but here we have the photograph that's of a historical situation draped over the topography. That is in fact Los Angeles. That 57, if it looks familiar, is in fact an advertisement for Heinz 57. And it was on the north face of the Baldwin Hills, so that you would see it as you rode the streetcar out toward Playa del Rey, out to the Ballona wetlands. The streetcar is just out of view here to the bottom. You would see it up on the hillside there. It was an era when putting things in white rock on hillsides was kind of popular. The Hollywood sign it postdates this a bit, but is the same sort of idea, just with a structure. But doing rock graffiti on hillsides was a thing. But it's not just this. We put together the entire region from the 1928 orthogonal aerials that had been scanned at UC Santa Barbara, and then they mosaic them together at Northridge. And if you look at this landscape, this is today, and you might guess where the water went historically. This is the Burbank airport, and you might go, okay, well, here's a wash and here's a wash. But even in the 1920s, even though quite a bit was developed, if you pull the slider over and reveal that landscape, you understand a whole lot better where water went on that landscape, right? You can see the rivulets coming down here. You can see them coming here and here and here, and the breadth of those features, these great washes, river washes that went across the San Fernando Valley north to south. And you can go anywhere basically in the LA Basin on the website Mapping Los Angeles Landscape History, and use this little slider tool to go back and forth. This is Tsiukanga, the Encino adobe is right here. This is Los Encinos Historic Park, and you know the what is basically the duck pond there that's next to a little cafe, and there's a spring right here that feeds the pond. You think, okay, well, what was that like? Well, there it is in 1928, and you can see the pond is there pretty much exactly. The spring is there pretty much exactly. You can see the adobe, and there's this little hill over here, which is gone completely. There was a little creek over here, that's gone. I think this hill got turned into a Mercedes dealership or something eventually. The park was set up even in 1928. There's the park just down the road a little bit, but there it is in 1928 laid out. And you can go around the entire basin like this to try to discern the past, at least what it was as of the 1900s. The next thing was the historical water features. And this was going back to those topographic maps of two different eras. There was the 1 to 24,000, the topos that you may be used to for hiking and whatnot. And before that, there was a coarser scale, but older series called it was 1 to 62,500 scale done by the USGS. And these maps, so this is the 1 to 62.5. These are those washes across the San Fernando Valley that we were seeing in the aerial photos just a second ago. This is a depiction of those washes in Blake Gumprecht's book about the Los Angeles River, so you know where that was coming from. But we were interested in actually grabbing these outlines of all the blue lines and all of the riparian features that we could find on these historical maps. And so we did, and this was my students at UCLA did this. These are the blue lines that we got from the 1 to 62.5. Not quite completely done. We haven't done all of Palos Verdes yet, but quite a bit. And you start to see just how much of water was influencing the Los Angeles landscape, because we hear so much from people, oh, Los Angeles is a desert and it's all dry and it's this and that. Well, as this winter showed and the mudslide on my street showed, there's a lot of water comes down every so often. And it had to have places to go, and it infiltrated and got into springs. And so all of the dots that are on here, like that one and that one and that one and that one, the blue dots are all springs. There's a series of other springs that we know about here from another project that are on this map. Spring, 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 spring. And then these are the villages that we worked on as well. This is the 1 to 24,000. So this is about 20, 30 years later. And what you can see is there's a higher resolution of detail because it's at a finer scale. We also didn't get as much done. We haven't done all the Santa Monica Mountains yet. But you can also see as things get erased, there's much less of the washes across the San Fernando Valley that are visible. Parts of the LA River kind of get erased in this period. And there's a tool on the website where you can go into one. This is the old one, 1 to 62.5, and that's the new one. And there's a slider where you can go back and forth to be able to compare those. They don't all align perfectly. We're going to work on that a little bit as time goes on. This is a project that doesn't have an end, in case you noticed. Started it in the 90s, still going. I will probably be able to work on another 20 years if I wanted to and never get this fully done. Next thing we did is sort of a quantitative approach to historical ecology, which was modeling the distribution of some culturally important trees. So we got together with the Indigenous Knowledge Group and said, what are the upland trees that you're most interested in knowing where they were? Because it's important for the tribes to be able to say, hey, this was an area where we did X, Y, or Z practice, like gathered walnuts or gathered acorns or important plant species, because that's important in the process of evaluating impacts for development, also for a number of other things associated with tribal beneficial uses under the Clean Water Act, et cetera. We didn't want to do the riparian species because when we started this part of the project, we didn't have that historical topography yet. And so all we had was the channelized areas, and that would be, wasn't going to be good. But so we did upland species here, and you'll see why we just did upland in a second. But it's a quantitative approach where we took a series of species and related them, I'll show you those in a second, and related them to elements of the natural landscape. Now it's a bigger scale. So these are all of the layers that go into it: topographic wetness and roughness and water storage and root zone depth and the temperature, the maximum temperature in the summertime and the minimum temperature in the wintertime, and the amount of precipitation. And I'm vamping because my computer is thinking about not advancing to the next slide. Come on, you can do it. So I'll just explain how it works. You take a whole series of locations of each of these species, and then you take these environmental layers and you use machine learning basically to put together the two things. So you put together the points with the environmental layers, and it decides and gives you the most important relationships between them, and then allows you to predict where it is that you would see those species given where you've seen them before. So basically it's a similarity of habitat. And from that, okay, good. Are we going to advance again? we've taxing it. So here's a bunch of points of scrub oak, and forgive the taxonomy, they get changed. So we put together Dumosa and Berberitifolia, and this then is our map of predicted scrub oak distribution in this larger study area. You can see this probably correlates pretty highly with chaparral, which we'll see in a second. And we did the rest of the oaks. So we did valley oak, we did mesa oak, we did coast live oak, and then we did California walnut. And again, I'm sorry for the delay. My computer's thinking about advancing the slide very hard, which might make it a good time. I know I said I'd go all the way through, but if there's a question at this point, we'll take it while my computer thinks about the next couple of slides. So sorry.
I'll throw in a question just to help fill the space. Did you combine Dumosa and Berberitifolia because of the similar characteristics of the plants?
Yes. Yep. We wanted to just get scrub oaks. All right. Okay, there we go. So there's our valley oak. Thank you, Charles, for filling that. There's our valley oak. As you see, Conejo Valley out in San Fernando Valley, and we know the distribution goes naturally about into Encino. The next one should be Mesa oak or Quercus engelmanni. That should come up there. Again, very distinct to Pasadena. Then we get to coast live oak as the dominant oak, and in fact, incredibly culturally important because there were whole, basically what Phil Ethington describes as the acorn aristocracies, histories of, sedentary societies that were built around acorns and oaks and promoting oaks on the landscape. So no surprise that we have a healthy distribution of coast live air. We didn't go up into the mountains. We stopped there. The next one should be the California walnut. And it honestly doesn't usually have this much of a problem. All right, I'll tell you what. Yeah. I think we're stuck waiting for a little bit here. I'm going to stop sharing for a second and see if I can free up some memory. All right. Okay. Again, my apologies for that. Let's try this again. Okay, so blue elderberry, because of its importance as a medicinal plant and a food source, and you'll see here where all the freeways show up. That's why we didn't want to do the riparian species because they would have just shown up in the waterways. This we would rerun with a cleaned up version of the historical topography eventually. So those are artifacts, but we do find elderberry pretty much across there. Then we get to California walnut, black walnut. This is the map, is mapped by a Cal State LA thesis in 1967 for California black walnut. Here it is mapped in 72 or 6, I forget, it should be on this slide, 72, in trees of California. And you can see it's a Southern California endemic. And then as we go along, we'll get to our map. I guess the maps are the problem of the big files. Okay. Once we get there. But this was super interesting to us because Matt Vestudo from the Quiche Nation, when I shared these results, he said, this is so great. Because we were just telling, it was a land use decision they had been consulted on. We were just telling people that this was a site that we would gather walnuts in, even though there's no walnut trees there today. And they knew that there used to be walnut trees because the story was that that's the place that you gathered walnuts. But the map provided a separate confirmation of that for people who needed to see it from a different way of knowing. We're very careful to say it's not a necessary thing to prove that it's true, but it helps to have multiple lines of evidence when talking to agencies about things. So this is our Juggins, California walnut map showing this real core of the distribution through the Santa Monica Mountains, out into the Puente Hills, up through toward Pasadena, and then out up into Ventura County. And also the Palos Verdes Peninsula. Interestingly, because I know and had as training data, there are some very old walnuts out there in the landslide area that's actually going into the ocean right now. So that's just the comparison between 1972 map and 2024 map. And also one of the interesting features of the map is we showed potential habitat going across the floor of the San Fernando Valley along some of these deep alluvial soil areas. And this is actually out on Roscoe and Shirley with some California black walnuts on a lot that this came to light because of a proposal to develop this site brought to my attention by one of our conservation colleagues, might even be here tonight. And it falls in one of the areas that we predicted as having higher incidence probability based on the soils. So those are the tools that we use to put together this whole thing. And the next piece of this are the macro groups, the mapping of the different habitat types. Now we use macro groups, and macro groups are kind of like how you discern regional variation in vegetation. It's geology, substrate, hydrology, disturbance, precipitation, so water, soils, slope, aspect, or whatnot. It's not down to individual species, although certain species are implicated in some of these, but it's the big group. So what do I mean by that? And macro group is a category within the US National Vegetation Classification Scheme. And so that's the level that we decided to do these maps. And I'm going to build in the different groups and explain what they are in this map here, which is basically just the LA watershed. So first is chaparral, and pretty obvious, you all know this. It's not gone. We don't need to figure out what it was because it's still here. That's the dark green. And this is at a 1 kilometer scale. So here's some chaparral. This happens to be on Catalina, but whatever. And this is like the dominant vegetation within each kilometer grid cell. So we refer to this as the Minecraft map. If any of you have kids or grandkids who play Minecraft, the sort of square building blocks. California grasslands and flower fields. So this includes basically the LA coastal prairie, areas in the basin that were either more arid and finer soils than the more deeply drained and wetter areas. So this was put together by a combination of substrate, soil type, and precipitation. And it's a hypothesis. We think that probably the Western San Fernando Valley was pretty much a forb field, and also in between some of these washes in the San Fernando Valley. This area here, probably some areas in Santa Monica and Mid-City and whatnot. And the plants would be, dot seed, plantain, the cactus, goldfields, belly plants, and wildflowers, especially this would all be prior to European contact, which converted all these things basically into exotic grasslands. But prior to that, heavy preponderance of annual species, some grasses, and highly managed as well, because if you read the explorer accounts, the Spanish coming through, when they met the natives in the LA Basin and up through Central California, they would always be given a porridge that was made out of chia seed. And so chia would grow in these areas and then they would burn them. And there's extensive descriptions of indigenous burning of grassland and scrubland areas. And it really is to promote the growth of desirable plants for them. And that, of course, was shut down by the California governors as a means of shutting down indigenous, land tenure and practices and whatnot. There's a whole section on this, if anyone's interested, in Rich Minnick's book about California grasslands. Just to zoom in a little bit, this is the sort of coastal prairie where I got started on historical ecology work. I didn't map all the vernal pools in here yet. That'll come. But we do have photographs of this. So this is the 1930s photographs that were in the LA County Natural History Museum, these two here. And you can go through this with a microscope and figure out the species. And we actually did that for that paper in 1997 about the LA coastal prairie. Coastal dune and bluff scrub, that's just this line along the edge. Of course, there's some bluff scrub down in PV as well. And looks kind of like this. That is actually a restored version of bluff scrub, but the dominant species, lupins, poppies, some atriplex, etc. Coastal sage scrub would be the other sort of dominant lowland basin vegetation type. And here again, it probably would also intergrade or be thicker or thinner depending on burning practices. So again, this is one that's still around. You can find coastal sage scrub in Palos Verdes, in the Baldwin Hills, etc. And again, hypothesis where the difference between this color and that color, did they grade into each other? Certainly. Were they both influenced by burning practices? Yes, they would have been as well. So a little coastal sage scrub, successional here at lower elevation in the Santa Monica Mountains.
Oh my God! Well, if Luke Carl tried to go stimulanato.
Yeah, there you go. Okay. Okay. So foothill and valley forest and woodland. So this is the macro group that includes all of the oak forests and the black walnut forest. So that fills in this area along here, the Puente Hills, the Debs Park, Mount Washington, Northeast LA, up into that area, also integrating with Chaparral in the Verdugo Hills, and the riparian oak forests up near Porter Ranch and places like that. So that is informed, of course, by those models, and would be something like this: scrub plants in the understory, and then also here, this is a walnut in more of a chaparral type environment up in the Santa Monica Mountains. So those would have been also very important culturally, both walnuts and oaks. Extremely important culturally and harvested by indigenous peoples for thousands of years. So riparian forest were basically what you might think of your gallery forest, your flat first level of floodplain around a river. So cottonwoods, alders, sycamores. And so here we have the LA River through Elysian Valley, some areas up here around San Fernando, the San Gabriel River, especially the lower portions of it. This is just a zoom in here to look at the Elysian Valley. So there's downtown LA, and then Arroyo Seco is more Riverwash. It was drier than the LA River, and so we mapped them a little separately. Were they exactly different? No, probably it's a gradation, but just enough to want to map them a little bit separately here. We know about the Elysian Valley because there are these incredible topographic maps done by Compton and Dockweiler, who were two surveyors who now have places named after them. But it gives you the detail of where these terraces were, where the islands in the river were, where the marshes were, where the walnuts, that was probably planted walnuts, but blackberries and gardens and whatnot. But out of that, we have from one of our previous projects, this map of the Elysian Valley showing the riparian forest would have been this light green along here with the active channel going through marshes, backwaters, oxbows, et cetera. And then also this upper terrace here would have been more oaks. So down here would have been the alders and cottonwoods and whatnot. And some of this was still around into the 20s and getting photographs taken of it. Active channel with the riparian forest on either side. Of course, then we filled it in and channel and forest on either side here. Just doing a little comparison of present day to historic. Riverwash is the next category. That is the sort of actively flooded and scoured river bottom, but can support things like willows, baccaris and whatnot, like in the channel in the LA River right now in Elysian Valley, where you do have some willows. That would be Riverwash habitat. We mapped these things across the San Fernando Valley as Riverwash as well. Were they alluvial scrub? Were they willow? Were they Riverwash? We can debate that, but suffice to say, that's what this is representing here. The upper San Gabriel, Arroyo Seco, south of downtown in the LA River, because it's pretty clear, at least it seems clear to me, that there was, and the textual accounts that it dried up in the summertime south of downtown. But then you get it emerging a little bit further down the river. So this is a picture of the LA River south of downtown in the 20s. That's very dry. That's very early succession vegetation. Then we have salt marsh. And salt marsh doesn't just include what you think of as a fully tidal salt marsh like around the San Francisco Bay, but it also includes the brackish marshes that were characteristic of seasonally closing estuaries. And I'm talking here about Ballona, and actually the Los Angeles River estuary down here, it didn't close, but it didn't have full tidal flushing either, because there were some very high sandbars, so that it's not a fully open navigable estuary. Like there's only really two in the entire state of California, which were San Diego Bay and the San Francisco Bay. But to varying degrees, this was a saltier salt marsh than Ballona. Ballona closed all the time. I'll just give you some indication of that. Here's a photograph pre-1887. I know it's pre-1887 because here is the berm that closes up the Ballona Lagoon entirely. And this gets referred to as a lake. I'll show you that in a second. Little shack there down in Playa del Rey, but it's completely close to the ocean. And that would have happened after the winter rains came and scoured it out. There's longshore drift and it would close it right back up again. That's the natural state for basically all California estuaries, with the exception of San Diego and San Francisco, and to varying degrees, a couple of others that don't close entirely, but don't have full flushing. And because of that, there's biodiversity that's adapted to it. This sea slug is adapted to having one larval form in an estuary when it's open and another larval form when it's closed. And clapper rails were described in 1910 in Los Angeles, specifically in Los Angeles, as being common in the salt and brackish marshes near the coast, becoming scarcer every year, very clearly identifying that the coastal marshes in Los Angeles were salt and brackish. And this is the map from early 1800s. You can see a little opening there, but that would close up routinely, as you just saw in the photograph. And we also don't find any of the plants that are associated with a tidally open, fully open estuary in the botanical records for Ballona either. You don't find cordgrass in there, or at least collected or observed until the early 1900s, after it gets jettied open. There's other layers of evidence there as well. This is a photograph of Ballona. That's not pickleweed. Those are tule. Tule is not a salt marsh species. It's a brackish species at its saltiest. And we also have these records of eggs and nests, which were like late 1800s, early 1900s Pokemon. People would go and collect actual eggs and nests and then put them in museums or their own collections. And we have them all at the Western Foundation for Vertebrate Zoology up in Camarillo. And the text on there is nest built at Ballona, nest built and lined with tule. And the picture from that era has tule as well. This picture is a little later than 1895, but same idea. That's a sign that it's a brackish environment and not a high salinity salt marsh. We also know it from the newspapers. These are two examples, 1872 and 1887. The 1872 one was the guy who was running the roadhouse down at Playa del Rey, because there's pretty much always a roadhouse in Playa del Rey. But he describes wanting to open the lake up to the ocean because it was separated by a 10-foot dune, and they dug it out. And he and his wife got swept out into the ocean and then rescued because they were basically opening that estuary to the ocean because it was getting, the water level was getting too high in Playa del Rey. The other examples from 1887, and this is from the Los Angeles Times, when there was it was basically a fight between San Pedro and Playa del Rey, which would become the port for Los Angeles. And so there was a big report in the LA Times about it, and it describes Ballona as being a true lake with earth formation that completely surrounds it, that the water is not drawn from the sea, and that in the rainy season, the creek breaks through the sandhills. So this tells us something about the ecology and how it functioned naturally, and what the species that were found there would have been adapted to historically. Other maps show this as well. This is the Hall irrigation map from 1888. There was actually at this time a jetty that had been constructed right there, but the draft map was done before the final map, and so it shows a full lagoon there at Ballona. The new piers come in 1887, and there they are. They show up on the 1887 map of the Coast Survey, and that's when we started having a permanently tidal wetland there at Ballona, and all the changes in the flora that go along with it. Our next category is freshwater marshes, and there may be more of these than you imagine, because we think of LA as being so dry, but there were quite a few wetlands. This entire area on the inland side of the Baldwin Hills was all freshwater marsh. There's a number of freshwater marsh areas down here approaching the San Pedro, Wilmington area. And these are just the places where they're big enough to like be the dominant thing in a kilometer squared. And as we go, so that they might have looked something like this. This happens to be a completely constructed freshwater marsh in South LA, but I don't mind that because that habitat was something that we're missing a whole bunch of. And as long as in that location, it used to be a maintenance yard for transportation, and now it's a freshwater marsh, I'll take it. Next category is something called, the official macro group is salt marsh meadows. But really what we use that is to identify alkali meadows, because many of them weren't associated with salt marshes. Usually they are associated with salt marshes, and some of them in our region are, but it's one that's basically gone unless you know where to look, but was pretty common. And it's this light green color here. There was a little bit inland from the salt marsh in Ballona, and then a whole line of it right along here. I'll explain why that is. And not on this map, but there's a whole bunch of it down in North Long Beach, Seal Beach, whatnot. And it's an herbaceous community that's seasonally flooded and then dries. So it's not good for shrubs. They don't like being inundated. And it's too dry to support water-loving trees. and it accumulates salts because it's rainwater and dry and rainwater and dry and rainwater and dry. And rainwater has some proportion of salts in it. Those salts get left behind, they accumulate in the soil. And so you get specialized alkali plant species like saltgrass that are dominant. And this is just a list of alkali species from the flora of Los Angeles. You can go back to Leroy Abrams' flora, I forget what it is, 10, I think, and go through that book. And you'll find all of these species that are either identified as found in alkaline flats or alkaline soils or alkaline sinks, or have alkali in the name. And are in fact adapted to alkali areas. And so this is one of those forgotten ones, right? As I said, there are places where the echoes of it, those plants are still there, but you gotta know to look to think that that's what it was, because we just think of them today, and many people look at them like it's a waste place, you know, not a lot growing. There's some of these funny little natives there, you know, crappy soil, but they were alkali meadows. This is that area that was a huge alkali meadow area associated with the San Gabriel system. I'm just bringing this in from our 2010 study on the San Gabriel watershed. That whole green area there. There wasn't a complete alkali map. This is from 19 teens, and every area that's got a color other than this one, these are all different levels of alkaline soils surrounding the wetlands, and then along a line sort of like that. Now you might start be thinking, you know, why is it? Why do we have these inland, why did we have the freshwater marshes and the inland alkali meadows here? And I want to sort of show you why that is. And then to do that, we'll look first at the soils map. And so this is downtown Los Angeles is here, and San Fernando Valley is up here. Water comes through the Elysian Valley, comes out, and these shapes in the soils, that's the typical shape of an alluvial fan, right? Something that's carrying sediment, comes out, spreads out. So the water's constrained going through the Elysian Valley, gets past downtown, and kind of spreads out. And over time, sometimes the water goes this direction, sometimes the water goes that direction. Same thing's happening with the San Gabriel and the Rio Hondo and whatnot. So these are all alluvial areas. You see they kind of get blocked right along here, all the way down here. Same thing with the Santa Ana River, all these alluvial things, and that gets blocked. And what's going on? Well, what's going on is the Newport-Inglewood structural zone, which is a fault line. And it creates the hills that go all the way from Cheviot Hills to the Baldwin Hills, Rosecrans, Dominguez, Signal Hill, all the way down to Bolsa Chica Mesa, are all part of this structural zone that uplifts these areas. It also captures a lot of oil. And so this is a heavy oil producing zone, every one of these. And the spaces in between them are called, in geological terms, are referred to as gates. And so there is a gate here where the water that comes out of the San Fernando Valley, sometimes in long history, tens of thousands of years, goes out here, and sometimes it goes out here, and sometimes it goes out here. But there's this line, and those soils line up along that structural line. So, and when it gets there, it's pretty flat. The water doesn't have anywhere to go. The water goes, then drops all its sediment. So you find where water's really slow, you get the finest sediment. So these are clay areas. Then the clay accumulates over time. And so things that get clayey and wet and then dry is a recipe to have alkali meadows. In some areas, it's going to be freshwater marsh down here where there's a lot of water, but along here we get a whole line of alkali meadows. And as I'll show again, there's also a thing called wet meadow, which is not as alkaline, but also periodically wet. So they tend to be upstream a little bit or up in elevation a little bit from the alkali meadows. So that's what gives us this line here of this color here, that alkali meadow line. It's what gives us the freshwater marshes here, the freshwater marshes here, because this line of scrub is the Newport-Inglewood fault. And it's from the Baldwin Hills, Rosecrans Hills on down. So I hope that makes that all make sense. Why is this grassland over here? That's because historically that the river deep history, tens of thousands of years. A lot of sediment came out over here, was blown back on shore, and this was a massive dune field, but very, very old, tens of thousands of years, but with the dune sandy underlayment that turns it into a grassland or a forb field instead of a shrubland. Okay, then we have vernal pools, spots here, 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 and here, and then all within there, which I haven't added to the map yet, were all vernal pools in that LA coastal prairie area as well. Seasonally flooded, with a shorter return time, not alkaline. And why do we know this? Because we've got vernal pool indicator species from herbarium specimens. This is actually an endangered species. Dry ditches like vernal pools down near the LA airport, the old municipal airport, Valoris lemoni, in Inglewood, exsicated places, a place that was wet and then dried, but in a different soil that doesn't have the alkali accumulation in it. So that we know, we had vernal pools in that area. Again, something that's almost entirely missing from our landscape. It would have been all across the LAX airport. This right here is from our photo mosaic. This turns into the airport later, but all these little divots and whatnot, every one of those would have collected water and then had the annual profusion of wildflowers. I also know a bit about this. My third grade teacher, I knew from Orono, Maine, grew up in Inglewood, California. And back when I was in grad school, I wrote her a letter and I said, do you remember anything about growing up in Inglewood? And I think it would have been in the teens, and going out to the ocean. What was west of town? What was west of Inglewood? As she says, I used to go out there as a Girl Scout. She wrote me this wonderful letter in longhand, and talked about all the poppies and the phacelias and the plants that then I put it in this paper because to help describe the LA coastal prairie, that there's just this massive flower field every spring with the vernal pools, with the fairy shrimp and the spadefoot toads and all those sorts of things. And some of that was still there when LAX did its expansion about 20 years ago. They found spadefoot toads, they found fairy shrimp, and of course they destroyed it. There are a few sites that still have some remnants left. This is Madrona Marsh, which is more like a vernal marsh, but a seasonal marsh nonetheless. There is this area in El Segundo between two railway tracks. I don't know if there's anything native left there. I don't know anybody who's gotten in there to survey, but it could be fun because it was part of the old LA coastal prairie. So wet meadow, that's just filling in these last pieces. Herbaceous and grass communities, significant moisture, seasonal flooding, but not as much as to accumulate the alkali, not as much as to hold the water long enough to be a vernal pool. So sedges and rushes and grasses, and you find them here, you find them in the upper watershed as well. So those all come together to this picture here, which now you'll understand is all those blue lines that we digitized, a series of some of the indigenous villages, some significant ones, the pathways that connect them, the various wetlands that are associated with them from a couple of different projects. We have the Santa Clara River and the Ventura River done as well. The Ballona has the outlines here of those the marshes and the wet meadows and the alkali meadows. We have them down for San Gabriel River and Port of LA as well. And then the purple lines are connecting them. These in the ocean are the indigenous knowledge groups projections of where the tomol routes were, which are the flat bottom canoes that were sealed with asphaltum to be able to go out to the Channel Islands, which were part of the cultural extent of the mainland tribes as well. Were out on the islands too, just to give this sense of the richness of this landscape as it was lived in for 9,000-10,000 years before we Europeans, I descended from them, showed up on this continent and started making changes to do things a different way, and quite frankly, to eliminate consciously, unconsciously, intentionally enslave the people who were here. And forget about them, basically. And I will also admit, for 20 some years of doing this work, I didn't think enough about that. And I'm trying to correct that and make sure that those stories and that knowledge is available, and that the people who are here and bearing that culture, who are still living in Los Angeles today, are recognized and part of the conversation about how we manage our land. We've done a bit more area. This is the Minecraft map of in the same color scheme for Ventura through LA County. We could continue, as I said, it could be never done, but that's where we are now. You can find these reports and many of the historical ones, historical reports that we've done at lalandscapehistory.org, as well as some interactive maps so that you can explore these things and look for the story map, which is where you can find the various elements of the historical photography and other work that I haven't even talked about the historical bird communities, and all of the videos from the tribes and their description of these places and their importance to them culturally. So with that, thank you so much. I'm sorry for the lagging computer, and I'd love to take questions, suggestions, corrections. As I present these things, none of this is written in stone. These are all, because it's history, they're all hypotheses that have to be able to be tested. And I can change my views on things in the presence of evidence or different understandings. So I really welcome a conversation about it.
Thank you, Travis. There were some questions in the chat that actually there's about 8. So first of all, is there anybody who wants to ask a question in person? Okay, then I think you just answered the question when you put up the website, but are all of these maps publicly available?
Yes.
So using that web address, the maps are there.
Yeah, and I'll actually, once we do the questions, and if people want to stay on, I'll actually walk through and show you where to view various of these maps.
Okay. I'm not really understanding. This was an early question. How was the prevalence of species done? Maybe somebody knows.
So how did we decide what went in each of these squares?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the way we would do that is first gather together all the information that we could possibly have, all the herbarium specimens, all the iNaturalist locations, all of the photographs, all of the maps, and whatnot, and then sit there with all these and precipitation and temperature and elevation and aspect and soils, and then sort of start filling in the things that we knew for sure, and then using sort of quantitatively predicted things to do the next step, like where were the walnuts? We knew a bunch about that because we did a model for the walnuts. And where were the oaks? Then we would, so like making the call between coastal sage scrub on a sort of an open area and grassland, that's based on usually on soils. And so that as you get more clay, you're much more likely to get into a grassland, which also comes from experience of working with people doing restoration work in Orange County and as well, where they would plant coastal sage scrub species in areas that they were thought to all be scrub, and then have them die out in some places. And it inevitably turns out that they're dying out in the places that are clayey. And they get too wet, and then they get fungal infections and they die. And so we developed some rules of thumb. But at the end of the day, it's a judgment call. You do the easy things first. Was there a vernal pool there? Yeah, we knew where the vernal pools, because they're topographic. Was there, was it alkali? Okay, well, alkali meadow. But there's gradations of alkali. And so was it wet? Was it mapped? Is there a description? And so it's just a matter of going through thing by thing by thing and painting, and that's why at the end here, I have to say, it's a hypothesis. It's a pretty good hypothesis, but it's a hypothesis.
Okay. Leslie Purcell has her hand up.
Hi, Leslie.
You want to unmute yourself?
Sure. Hi, Travis. Nice to see you. Yeah, the first part where you were talking about working with the different tribal groups, I'm not sure that I heard mention who we worked with way back, the Gabrielino Tongva as one of the entities, groups right around there, the Ballona area, LA, downtown, and so forth. I know it's a little tricky sometimes.
Yeah, so the way the groups that we worked with came together was our co-PI, Nat Zappia at Cal State Northridge, who passed away during the project tragically from a tumor. He worked on indigenous food systems and had been very active and knew a lot of people. And he had one very close contact from the Fernandino to Tavium at Cal State Northridge that he worked with. And so we started with him because Nat had a level of trust with him. And then he picked and put together the team that would and we had a limited number of people who could be involved because we had limited funding, because everybody got some funding. And the IK, Indigenous Knowledge Group, picked their own collaborators. And so we had a different tribal rep of the Gabrielino Keech, who don't use the name Tongva, because it's a name that came later on. The Keech name comes earlier, and that's the one that they use. But prior to that, we had another participant who had to drop out, who was Gabrielino Tongva. So they sort of defined their criteria for who they wanted to work with. And we didn't feel it was our place to, once we had an entree and a good relationship, to govern that on their behalf, right? So the indigenous group, they said, these are our rules, these are our people. We're dealing with tribes that can document lineal descendancy genealogically.
Thanks, appreciate it.
There was some of these questions, I don't know. Somebody said, is that little tiny brown smudge on the map? So that's Baldwin Hills, that's kind of off in the middle there, off the coast.
The brown smudge Baldwin Hills? Probably. Yeah, I'll show you the maps in a second here. It's from Cindy. I'll show you. We'll go look at the Baldwin Hills.
We'll revisit that.
Yeah.
Somebody came in late and was confused about burning in Northern California versus burning in Southern California. And I answered that we're talking about Southern California here.
Yeah. And so if you read the Spanish Padres, who came along and were the documentarians for the and setting up the mission system and whatnot, there is account after account of indigenous burning, seasonal indigenous burning in Southern California. Like when they come, and I'm trying to remember, I think it's the account of the Crespi account, when they come up over the Sepulveda Pass and go into the San Fernando Valley, they're like, it's burned as far as the eye can see. Now, whether or not that's everything was actually burned or whether along the paths it was burned, in an area. We can all debate that, right? But burning was used here very clearly as a means to promote the growth of certain plants and ensure that they wouldn't turn into other types of vegetation. So, and chia being a very important plant that could be promoted that way, but also blue dicks and some other things that are used. And, hence the book, Kat Adderson's book, Tending the Wild, is about, manipulating the land for purposes of food and fiber.
Someone asks, can a person investigate their own personal geographic space for prehistoric botany? So can you get down that fine to actually say to yourself, well, here's my yard in Van Nuys. What was here
Yeah.
pre-Europeans?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. You have to do some extrapolation. And my students are doing this right now. We're doing a senior practicum project with a bunch of undergrads for the historical ecology of the Santa Monica Airport site because they're starting a whole planning process for the Santa Monica Airport. Like, well, what was here? We don't know. Now, do we have botanical records for the Santa Monica Airport? Turns out we don't. But we do have all these tools to know what species were in the vicinity, what species were in similar places, like, for example, Soldier's Home, which turns into the VA in West LA, is a very similar topography to Santa Monica Airport. And there were botanists at Soldier's Home, and they did do collections. And so you can, Hess was there, the guy who collected a bunch of Dudleyas. And so you can do these sort of similarity questions. You can look at soils and do similarity. And so as we go into the maps, you can go and look at your site. You can see what our 1 kilometer says for your location, but recognizing things will be different depending on slope and aspect and rainfall and where the water runs and all that sort of thing. It's the dominant that we were trying to get at. But so it's rare that you can have the botanical history of your particular site. And of course, we as individuals aren't going to have access to, if you had a pond that was contiguous back into prehistoric times, you could take a core and look at the pollen or something, but that's not something we can do. We have to extrapolate from the tools that we have now.
Someone asked how this could be used, this data, if you were going to make a movie about prehistoric geographic or how a place looked.
Yes. I have a dream.
This is AI?
I have a dream on this. So there is software that's the stuff that they used to do Avatar, where they sort of generate landscapes inside the computer that are sort of photorealistic. I think we could do that with these data. You could populate but it would take the Hollywood level software. I've not cracked that nut yet. I don't have the money to do it yet. But I would dearly love to sort of do an immersive, gamification, if you were, of exploring Los Angeles in the Indigenous era. It would be fascinating.
Someone mentioned can Spanish names for places, and the example is Nogales, which stands for black walnut. Can that be used to map the fact that black walnuts were historically in an area?
Yeah, we do use names, and especially in the appropriate era, Spanish names. In the Indigenous era, Indigenous names is a great example on the website of Santa Monica Mountains, where there's a place that's named after pine trees, where probably during indigenous history, there used to be native pine trees, but now they're gone because the climate has changed. But the name is retained. So we do use names all the time, but we also try to have multiple lines of evidence for something. So we'll find like there's a name here, it means alder. Well, does it make sense that there would have been an alder there? Do we find the appropriate wetness conditions in the topography? Do we blah, 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 blah. So, but we absolutely are looking for that all the time on maps. Is any kinds of clues as to what was in a place. And then you always have to ask the question, was it planted? And sometimes it was going to, and sometimes it wasn't. In deep history, probably there's a lot of things that were planted, right? There are a lot of walnuts and acorns were planted by people, and we kind of accept that that is part of the indigenous landscape.
Okay. Someone pointed out that you said that Bolsa Chica was a seasonal wetland, and now spending zillions of dollars or whatever to keep it open.
Yes.
Is that contrary to its natural state?
Well, I have a different talk where I go into this in a lot more detail, but there was never an opening at Bolsa Chica where they built the opening. And those of us who knew, I wasn't involved in that conversation at the time, but others were like, that's going to sediment up because it doesn't want to be open there. That's not where it's not going to stay open. The only way they keep it open is by dredging it. And they blew through their entire maintenance budget in about 10 years because they didn't understand well enough how the natural system worked. They tried to open it where it didn't want, in quotes, to open. And then they're like, well, this is going to be a failure unless we get a bunch of money to continue to expend fossil fuels to keep it open. To which those of us who study historical ecology respond, could have told you that. In fact, you probably ought to think of something else as a way to do it. We do manipulate things all the time for purposes of conservation, but it's always good to be clear-eyed about what's going to happen and understand what the natural tendency of a place is, even in its modified state, so that you don't end up holding the bag and thinking your restoration is going to fail because it's sedimenting in, because that's exactly what was going to happen from the start.
Okay. This is more of Diane makes a comment that as an ecological gardener, she makes and unmakes, but your presentation makes a good case for focusing more on unmaking, depave, explode, jackhammer, rip out, subtract, connect, protest.
Sure.
More of a comment.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think what it does for me is helps connect to place in a deeper way than we're typically do in the city, and imagine that it is all part of a connected system and that there could be a role for a garden, a city strip, a backyard, that is an echo of and yearning to be a connected place again. That gets into a whole set of concepts around how we go about conservation and the problems of thinking about conservation as being the nature's over there and we people are over here. And we just can't do that anymore. We've got to figure out how to integrate and interdigitate the nature with the places that we live.
Well, another question has come up and it's relevant to the Bolsa Chica comment. Are we going to make the same mistake at Ballona? Turning it into a saltwater marsh? Do you think?
Well, okay, so it's a matter of public record. My thoughts on Ballona. And they're basically that it was built around the idea of restoring something that never existed. And that it was a closing estuary, that it wasn't as far below high water as the planners thought it would be, because the planners have all imprinted on the San Francisco Bay and not on actual Southern California estuaries. So I do believe there are things that we could do constructively with equipment at Ballona that would improve its resiliency for the future. But I do not believe that the current project is well guided or guided by the history and function of the area, and will be damaging to those species and habitats that persist there. Sadly, because it's our state that's doing it. And it's not for lack of trying, just so that everybody knows this isn't a Johnny come lately, criticism. I talked to the people who were doing, as soon as we did this research back in 2010, 3 scientists, me as one of them, went and talked to the head of the Bay Foundation that was leading the development of the options for Ballona. And we said, hey, you might want to rethink this meander and thing, because it just didn't exist. It doesn't make sense. And it was a closing estuary, and you want to think about this differently, especially in the face of sea level rise. And we were told to not confuse the public with the facts that we had found in our study. I took it to the head of the Coastal Conservancy that was funding it, former head, not the current head. I met with him. I laid it out. This is early in the planning process. I said, we've learned this. Our understanding of the site is not what it used to be. And you need to take a step back and reconsider how you approach this for the nature of the biodiversity. And you can probably do something that wastes a lot less energy in terms of moving dirt around, because there's some misconceptions about how much dirt was where and how much is fill and how much isn't. And I was told, well, we've gotten so far along the planning, sometimes you just got to go with the project you have. That was a decade ago. And they have continued along this road of not wanting to rethink something that quite literally was, glommed onto before the historical ecology had been done. And so it's just really unfortunate, and it makes me sad, because it's the state now that's pushing something that they would never permit a private developer to do.
Okay.
Aren't they revamping that now?
We'll see. I think they're going to redo their EIR, and whether they actually redesign the project remains to be seen. I see a question about beavers. Now,
Yes.
there's a topic. Okay, so here's what I know about beavers. Wrote a paper about beavers because they were in Lake Skinner in San Diego, and they were trying to remove them. And the ecologists down there were upset about them. And our point was, well, be careful what you wish for, because they're creating some really great habitat for some endangered species, and they're native not too far away. And, probably 30,000 years ago they were there. So, make sure you know what you're doing. Do I have evidence that beavers were in coastal Los Angeles in the last 10,000 years? I don't. Do we have place names, in indigenous place names in Santa Barbara County and north that place beavers near the coast? Yes, we do. There's a group of ecologists who I respect highly in San Diego, work for the federal government, who wrote a big paper. They're like, there's no stinking beavers in Southern California, and you're all wrong, and you all you've misinterpreted the literature, and blah, blah, blah. And I think the truth is probably somewhere in between. When they say Southern California, they mean San Diego, because when I call them up and say, well, how about Santa Barbara? They're like, oh, well, we didn't mean Santa Barbara. It's like, well, that's kind of Southern California. So there is a very tantalizing reference to beavers being in Malibu by Mike Davis, City of Quartz, who's passed away. And I could never track down a primary source that he had to make that reference. So I don't know. We gotta say, I don't have direct evidence of it. I believe that the record in the CESP is real, and so maybe as far down as Ventura County, but I don't have them in coastal LA County. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't, maybe it was too long ago.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions that people want to ask in person?
Yeah, and those of you who want to stay, I'll just share if people don't mind a few more minutes,
No,
I'll share this website. So this is LA Landscape History. A couple of sections to know about. The reports page has the most recent report, 2023. That's mostly what I was presenting tonight. This is the 2021 where we did a bunch of the first round of the LA Basin. This is the Elysian Valley study for the Nature Conservancy. Here's the Ballona Creek one. Here's Gabriel River. Each of these, and then there's this one I started in the 90s. This is the LA Coastal Prairie, which I need to digitize now. How to access maps. There's two ways. One is to just go to the Maps tab. And here, the one I was just looking at that may be useful to you is this, this one. These are interactive sort of mapping apps. And when it opens up, it should pull up. And again, we have a memory issue while I'm running so many things. It should pull up a map of the region, and then the LA watershed layers on top of it. And then you can pick the different habitat types that you want to visualize. Okay, so there's coming, takes it long enough. So up comes that. And so over here will come a legend. And as you click on the legend, it will turn off and on these squares for different habitat types. And you can click on any square and get our best guess of what the probable most likely thing was in your square kilometer. So that, and I won't force us to watch that any longer.
What's the website called again?
Okay, so you start at lalandscapehistory.org, and then you get to this one through the maps tab. And it's the first map on the upper right. We're going to have also what's called a Geo Hub, but we haven't released that yet, where you can, if you work in GIS or you're a consultant and might be interested in using some of these layers, they're all going to get posted for anybody to download and play with. Okay, so there you go. So say I'm interested in, where was the coastal sage scrub? I can just click on that and it'll show me that. Or where were the oak and walnut woodlands? That's there. Okay, I can turn that one off. Okay, so there's our oak and walnut woodland within this watershed. This isn't including most of the Santa Monica Mountains. Okay, so that's that one. This one includes some other layers that are polygons. But the other one that you should look at, or I think you should look at, is go to 2023 final report. And you can read the whole report if you'd like, but there's also this thing called a story map. So if you click on that, and this will take time to load because it's a lot of stuff. It includes all the sections on the different villages that are done by the tribes. It has embedded video, and then it has each of the areas that we talked about, plus some that we didn't. So there's a section on ancient roads, on the waterways, on the topography, on the bird communities, on the potential natural vegetation, etc. And so this is the one, and that also has the sliders that go back and forth on the historic aerial, and looking at the waterways from the 1880s, 90s, and the earliest periods. So this one, I just encourage you to go and explore on your own. There's this is the way you find different sections. So Yangna, that's downtown LA, Himalibu is Malibu, Topanga's Topanga, Siukonga's Encino, Chocmenga is San Fernando, Shavanga is the Whittier Narrows, Wavunga is Long Beach. Then you've got the ancient road section, the historical topography, and historical aerials, historical water features, birds, trees, potential natural vegetation, etc. So if I did, for example, aerials, clicked on that, that'll take me down here. And as you get to it and you're scrolling through, it will then load up these interactive maps. And that's the start of it. It'll take a little while to do this. On the left side will be the 1920s aerial. On the right side will be 2023, give or take. So that's, but again, don't try to do this on a phone or a tablet because it will vomit in computer terms. You need to do it on a laptop or a desktop to be able to manage this and have patience with it, because there's just an enormous amount of data behind here that has to load up and get served out to your device. So as this comes up here, we've got looks like I'm going to say Whittier Narrows. And in another couple of seconds here, it should load up the aerial, the historic aerial, and then you'll be able to go back and forth from the one to the other.
So these are in the final reports or the.
Yeah, so the link to this is on the 2023 final report page.
Okay.
Okay, and it's called the story map.
There's another question that came up without those historic maps that you, I mean, that's a lot of historic maps. Without those, basically this project would have been dead in the water.
Well, okay, so maps proper are incredibly important to this effort. We do have other spatial data, but if you eliminate maps, it makes it tough, right? So you'd still have potentially well-documented herbarium specimens that said, I found this here, I found that there. You would potentially have, okay, diseños, the Spanish map, but those are maps. You could have aerial photos. That's not a map. So we'd have these. You would have textual accounts. So we also consult newspapers and do newspaper searches, figure out the old names for places, search the old names, look for them in newspapers. I mean, so for example, we also have the locations of the birds and the bird nests. So bird skins and bird nests. And some of those, so for example, there's one by Alphonse J., that guy who had the one in the talk. He recorded some birds that were associated with Riparian Forest. So I was interested in them at Watson's pasture in Los Angeles. Yeah, I got these in Watson's pasture. And I'm like, great, thanks so much. Where's Watson's pasture? And for years, I was stymied by this. This is just demonstrating the slider for the historical aerials. Until ultimately there's a newspaper archive at UC Riverside. And I searched Watson's pasture in it in the Los Angeles Herald, which was the precursor to the LA Times. And lo and behold, there was a lost and found ad for a cow. And the cow had been found in Watson's pasture, and it gave cross streets, and it was along the LA River in Boyle Heights. And so that's where we learned where Watson's pasture was. But maps are the lifeblood of a project like this, right? Current maps, and not just maps, but geographic information science and GIS systems, to be able to have the technology to stitch together historical aerial photographs and place them reasonably accurately. It's not perfect, but you get the idea. On on a place, to be able to layer, to be able to do spatially sophisticated quantifications to figure out where, you know, statistically you would be likely to find things that are similar to other places, would be pretty tough without maps.
Thank you.
All right. Again, so just to find that one, that's the story map on the 2023 final report, which you can get to right there. And the other ones are on the map table. And then if you just hit reports, you can download all the rest of the studies. And if you want more, like you're interested in the northern San Diego lagoons and estuaries, there's a report for that. It was led by the San Francisco Estuary Institute, SFEI. SFEI has a ton of these studies. They host the Santa Clara Ventura River study. They have the northern San Diego County lagoons. We have an entire monograph on the Tijuana River Estuary. There's a new study about the city of Riverside and the river through the city of Riverside that just came out. They've done this entire exercise for the San Francisco Bay and set bay restoration goals based on the historical ecology. So that's another place to look for these things, is San Francisco Estuary Institute, sfei.org.
And what about the Santa Monica Mountains area? Are you working on the Santa Monica Mountains?
Well, this report has all of those trees that were modeled from the Santa Monica Mountains.
Oh, okay.
So all that's in that report. There's a
Okay.
previous report that we talked about maybe a couple of years ago about walnuts.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
that one is the eastern Santa Monica Mountains in particular. And I think we want to continue this work and are investigating ways, especially with the collaboration with the tribes, because we've gotten a level of, a working relationship of, trusting working relationship to help them in some of the work that they need to do relative to, compliance with laws that protect tribal resources. And so some of that will be supportive there. We're always got a next step in mind. Some of it's really nitty gritty, nuts and bolts, like we need to clean up the topographic map that we created, expand it a little bit, run some different analyses on it. And eventually I want to be able to model the distribution of the riparian species, not just the upland species, with that new historical topography. I'd like to work with some folks who do more water modeling to run some of the sort of hydrodynamic models on the LA River that on the historic topography instead of the current topography, to maybe get at some of these questions about when and how long it flowed above ground, when it went underground. There's tons of questions. The question somebody asked earlier about the visualization, the Hollywood visualization, if we had the funding to do that, oh, I'd love to do that. That would be so much fun to get this out into an immersive exhibit somewhere for people to really get a grasp at this landscape and not go, oh, well, LA is a desert and blah, blah, we should expect a desert. No, it's not a desert, very clearly not a desert. And even under climate change scenarios, there's such richness here that will and could, be here for the next 80 to 100 years. Even in the most pessimistic of scenarios, we should be sharing this with people.
Well, Diana just asked the question, where next? I think you just answered that question. There's myriad things that you could do.
Yep.
That the funding, where's the funding coming from?
Yeah, well, the last two bits were funded by the John Randolph Haynes and Dora Haynes Foundation. They're not likely to be, their funding model's changing a little bit. They're not likely to be the funding for the next. So we'll be looking. We're going to do some stuff without funding. The next thing that's going to happen is this, it's called a GeoHub, the sharing of the data for people who want to use them. My students are doing the Santa Monica Airport, so that'll be next. Conservancies, governments are often the ones that fund this kind of thing. But we'll have to see. We'll have to see what comes up. The indigenous piece of this opens up different avenues in terms of funding sources, where it turns it from being an ecological, biological question into a cultural question, and a cultural history and sovereignty and indigenous, representation question. So those efforts or possibilities will be led by our partners, and I'm happy to support in that event.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for making this presentation. I hope people will explore the website and see how rich the data is there. And unless there are any other further questions or something that we forgot to cover, I'd like to say good evening, I guess. I think.
Yeah, if you
Did you have
could
something you wanted to add?
I would just
Travis?
ask if you can save the chat and send it to me. That'll help me remember, if you have a way to do that. That'll help me remember what was talked about.
I don't know how to do that. Is Louise still here?
But thanks, everybody. We really appreciate you coming and asking all the questions and
I know that-
engaging in the material.
Okay, is there a good resource for finding out more about the specific plant communities represented on the map? What kind of plants would be found in them, etc.?
Yeah, go to the reports section of LA Landscape History and look at the San Gabriel River study, or the Ballona one. Both of them talk about some of the ones that aren't as common, right? Wet meadow, alkali meadow. The vernal pool one, go to the 1997 LA Coastal Prairie and its vernal pools. And those reports also have appendices that have extensive lists of herbarium specimens and presumed present plants that aren't vouchered with herbarium specimens. So there's a lot of botanical, floristic detail in those reports. A little bit less in the most recent study because we just focused on a few species with new information, but the San Gabriel study and the Ballona study and the LA Coastal Prairie study all have plant lists as appendices or included.
Okay.
I have something for Travis. If you open the chat screen,
Mhm.
at the bottom, you'll see little symbols and there's 3 dots. If you hit that, it says save chat.
Oh, okay. So do
Yeah,
you
I
want
don't-
to save it yourself, Travis?
I don't have the save button on my version, so.
It's not a save button. It's just at the bottom. Do you see like a smiley face, a little page, a little T? At the
Yes,
very
but I
bottom.
don't
Go to the chat.
yeah, but I
At-
don't have the 3 dots to save it. So
Oh, you
Yep.
do not have 3 dots?
I don't.
Hmm.
No.
Okay,
I saved
but
it.
That's
I
okay.
can
does.
s- I
Anyway,
can send it
that's
to you,
fine.
Travis.
Okay. Thanks.
Louise-
It's just, it's a text file.
Yeah,
Okay, Louise saved it. Okay,
Thank you.
Louise.
Didn't mean to waste everybody's time with that.
So Louise, you'll email it to Travis?
I have it. I need his email address.
Longcore at ucla.edu.
And did somebody have a hand up?
Oh, I did. It's Leslie again.
Okay.
Travis, I'm reliving some past times. We had some vernal pools on the side of the west bluff above the
Yes.
Ballona wetlands and on
Yep.
top of the bluff.
Yep.
And we were not able to save that area. And so hopefully
Yes.
all the work you've done will help in the future for some of these projects and places.
Yeah, I do remember, as I recall, that case got all the way to California Supreme Court, but yeah.
Yeah. And also I'm thinking about Santa Monica Airport in terms of the cultural sites. I don't know that particular site, but we certainly had burials down on the wetlands and so forth, and that was very, very difficult. So hopefully you all will be able to
Yep.
negotiate that better.
Yeah. I don't know how that's going to turn out. We're not there yet. So
We appreciate
So-
you. Thank you.
thank
Yeah,
you.
Travis, this is Adela Barnett. I had one other comment. I'm a docent up at the Point Vicente Interpretive Center and also volunteer at the Madrona Marsh. And they have tons of artifacts and all kinds of, cooking evidence and all kinds of things
Yep.
from the Palos Verdes Peninsula of the
Yep.
Tonga, but you had an earlier name for them. Indians there, I believe they maybe lived seasonally between Los Angeles and the Palos Verdes Peninsula. But there's tons of evidence. You can go to the Point Vicente Interpretive Center if you're interested, and you can see there's just like a small fraction of a collection that one man had that has, hundreds of items, all found right there on the grounds. And then the Tongva people themselves, they have an annual or maybe once every couple years, a celebration in the Madrona Marsh, and they talk about their folklore and songs and things. So they see that as a place that they identify with.
Thank you for that.
And I think that a lot of the artifacts or cultural items are supposed to be returned at this point, if possible.
These are kind of archaeological things that were just found in the dirt. They're just on the trails. You'd find like a mitten, like a little kitchen area with little remains, arrowheads and things. I don't know that they have much value or who they would return them to, but that's an interesting concept.
Yeah, well, the local tribal people presumably, but yeah, I know there's been some legislation around that, I think, federal and maybe state, but I haven't really been involved with it lately. But I certainly for burial objects, they are to be returned. I don't know about those other kinds of things specific.
Yeah, that's something really we don't speak to right now. I think that's off. It's outside the expertise of this presentation this evening, I think. And contact your local tribal leaders and ask that question. All right, folks, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Travis, and hope you have many, many more years of doing this kind of work. It's really very, very important to us here.
Great. Thanks for having me. Thanks for the invitation and for everybody for sticking it out.
Okay, thank you.
All
All right, guys.
Thanks.
night.
Bye.
See you soon. I'm going to end the meeting. Good night.